This is the Etiology podcast. I am your host, Elka Kubaku, licensed social worker and psychotherapist. In this podcast, we explore divisive issues around food, health, and body image with the goal of mending relationships within the eating disorder recovery professional community and creating a space where a multiplicity of perspectives can coexist harmoniously. This podcast is uncensored and encompasses the political and ideological spectrum. If you believe something you hear is harmful or misinformed, please be respectful to the speaker. And also, feel free to reach out about recording another episode on the same topic from your vantage point. My hope is that if, as professionals, we can hold each other's stories with respect and compassion, we'll be better able to do so for our clients. The stereotype is that eating disorders are a young woman's illness. Many treatment centers cater primarily to young people, and even adult treatment centers often have a predominantly young adult population. As a result of this, when someone experiences an eating disorder in midlife or later, they may face not only the challenges and stigma of the diagnosis, but also a sense of isolation. The reality, however, is that eating disorders can affect people from any age group. In this episode, Betsy Brenner shares her story confronting and recovering from an eating disorder in midlife. She discusses her experience living parallel lives, outwardly maintaining her image as the happy, perpetually positive person she was taught to be, while secretly struggling deeply, and what it was like to finally confront painful emotions after decades of suppression. Betsy is a recovery speaker, peer support mentor, and author of a beautiful memoir, The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife. Betsy is a former hospital attorney and longtime high school tennis coach. She has also been a hospice volunteer and speaker on grief and end of life decision making. For the past decade, she has led a bereavement group in her community. Now, her primary focus is on speaking, mentoring, and leading support groups in the eating disorder field. She has shared her story at treatment centers, conferences, and through webinars and podcasts, offering hope and guidance, especially to athletes and women in midlife facing similar challenges. Betsy holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Brown University and a Juris Doctorate from American University Law School. Hi, Betsy. Thanks so much for joining me today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Can you start by telling me a little bit about what you do in the eating disorder recovery world?
Sure. I honestly never could have envisioned being in the position I am today, but in
Mhm.
2021, I published my memoir, The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife. It was a product of the pandemic. I was given the gift of time. I never planned to write a book, share my story publicly. I'd always been a very private person. Even when I wrote my initial recovery story and shared it at treatment centers in Boston back in 2018, it didn't even cross my mind that I would put my entire life story into words. And what happened is one thing led to another. I guess there weren't many memoirs out there showing that recovery was in fact possible in midlife. And I'm really glad I put my email in the back of my book because I hear from women in midlife from around the world. And it's just one of those categories of eating disorders that sometimes gets overlooked. And I'm grateful now to be able to travel and speak around the country, sharing my story, talking about eating disorders in this age group. And I also do one-on-one mentorship virtually and in person here in Rhode Island. And I run peer support groups, both virtually and in Rhode Island, because I like being that person who gets it, who understands that person that someone has in between the professional appointments. I'm pure peer support, someone with lived experience, and everyone I work with is under the care of a licensed clinician. So it's that extra support.
Yeah, so you're the person who can be like, I've been there and I can be with you through this
Exactly.
as people are working with other professionals.
Yes.
Very cool. So you said you're a very private person. Sharing your life story is not something that you would naturally be inclined to do. What led you to the point? What led you from private person to writing your whole story in a book?
That's a great question. I love answering it. So, as I said, I had written my recovery story in 2018 and shared it at treatment centers, but even then I wasn't really being open and honest with friends and people not in my immediate inner circle. And even when I did tell people I had struggled with an eating disorder, I made it sound like it was something way in the past. But then a little shortly before the pandemic in very early 2020, I had been told by several people, both in the professional eating disorder world and personally, that my life story had the makings of a book if I was willing to take the time and put the effort into it. But at that point, I certainly didn't have time and I couldn't imagine putting the effort into it. But I
Mhm,
decided that maybe this would be a really good long-term project to write my life story for me only to help myself heal on the deepest level possible. And
mhm,
when the pandemic hit, I ended up writing my entire manuscript from March of 2020 to January of 2021. And even as I was writing the first several months, I still wasn't even thinking about publishing or sharing. It was legitimately for the sole
mhm,
purpose of helping myself heal on the deepest level possible. But as I was
mhm,
getting further into it, I was told by my editor and others that, you may have something here. So why don't we give it a shot getting it published? So I did. And the word that comes to mind now, having gone from such a private person to now very public, it's freedom. And I didn't see
mhm,
that coming. I was very anxious about putting my story out there, letting people know that I actually had struggled fairly recently and that people would know these details that I had never shared publicly. But now that I have, it is so freeing. It allows me to be
mhm,
vulnerable, it allows me to live my life authentically. It allows me to use my voice. It's just pure freedom. So, something I never ever imagined is now the reality, and I'm very grateful.
mhm. Yeah. So you had shared your story before publishing your book, or half shared it, which is often what we do. We share the areas where we're already resolved or sort of fixed. And I hear you saying you had shared it in some way publicly, but were still more quiet about it with the people you knew.
Yes. Yes.
Tell me about.
Yeah, when I wrote my recovery story in 2018, when my recovery was in a very strong place, I had the privilege of sharing it first at a program called Hope and Inspiration that Meta hosts in Boston.
Yeah.
And from there, I met people from treatment centers in the Boston area only who wanted me
Mhm,
to come share my story with the current clients. So even when I was doing that, and again, I hadn't put my whole life story into words, it was really just what led to my eating disorder and my recovery journey, not all the details that are in my memoir. Even when I'd be going up to Boston to speak at a treatment center, I couldn't even be honest with people in my life. I'd be like, oh, yeah, I have a seminar up in Boston, or I'm going to meet a friend.
wow.
Even then, with my recovery in a good place, I was so secretive about it. And I think the older we are, I mean, when we struggle with an eating disorder, the more shame and secrecy there tends to be. I mean, I think we've made a lot of progress with that stigma and shame, but we still have a ways to go. And I think the older we are, the more shame and secrecy we have because people who don't understand eating disorders view it as you're a mature adult. What's your problem? Just eat or whatever, not understanding what an eating disorder truly is. So it wasn't until
Can
my
you?
book was being published that I was able to be open and honest and admit that I
Mhm,
struggled in midlife and if I had stopped with simply my recovery story in 2018, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
mhm. Tell me, you were saying that in mid-age, or as an older adult, it's even more difficult to tell people that you're struggling. There's more shame. Tell me about what that was like for you when you were still in that shame space before you worked up the courage to publish your story in a book.
I would say I was leading two parallel lives. Well, first of all, when I was diagnosed in my 40s, I had the same preconceived notions that most people have. I was in my 40s. How could I have an eating disorder? Isn't that something that only young adults and adolescents get? So I had a lot to learn when I was first diagnosed. But once I started treatment, which for me was all outpatient with both a therapist and dietitian who specialize in eating disorders, that's sort of another midlife issue. There was not local treatment, and I didn't know it was okay to prioritize my recovery. And I wasn't willing to disrupt my family life and go away to treatment. The really important piece of that is that I was medically stable at all times. So it remained my choice. My recovery journey may have been a lot shorter had I gone to a higher level of care, but fortunately,
Hmm.
my eating disorder was diagnosed as I was heading down a very dangerous path, but before I got too far. So, anyway, during this time with my outpatient team, going to my appointments every week, I'm such a rule follower and, trying to be that perfect good
Hmm.
girl and do what I'm told. I was living two parallel lives. There was that Betsy Brenner who went to all her appointments and did the best I could in recovery for, 6 or 7 years. Obviously, it's never linear, but my parallel life, and I didn't allow the two to intersect till much later on. I was a high school tennis coach for many years, raising 3 kids at home, happily married, involved in my community. So I was living two parallel lives, and I didn't know how to connect the two. I
Hmm.
really kept that one road very secret. And
Yeah.
so that those two parallel roads existed for probably 6 years or more.
Wow. And even as you were sharing your story in treatment centers, you were still hiding that
For
from
the
the people
most part,
closest to
yes. By then, I had let in a few close friends. But when I first started to do that, my team would encourage me to open up. The response wasn't necessarily what I needed to hear. So, of course, that prevented me from wanting to open up more.
tell me more about that wasn't necessarily the response I needed to hear. That sounds like a very softened version of something that can be pretty
Yes,
painful.
well, I decided at some point that I really needed to let a few people in. I've always had, many good friends. So I started with some of my closest friends. One of them is a healthcare provider. And we
Mm.
were on a walk one day, and I said, there's something I need to tell you. I've been struggling with an eating disorder. And instead of her being like, oh, I'm so sorry. How can I support you? I wish I had known. She said to me, "Don't let that happen," and told me about somebody else that she had heard of. So that immediately shut me right down. And then another very close friend, when I had the courage to tell her, she said all the right things like, "Oh, I'm here for you. Let me know how I can help." Um, I never mentioned it again. And I hadn't found my voice yet. I didn't know how to let people in. Didn't know how to say, even with my own husband, I've now been happily married for 34 years. I didn't know how to help somebody help me. Eating
Hmm.
disorders are just such an isolating illness.
Yeah.
So I sort of did my thing, but I didn't know how to say, I hadn't found my voice yet.
Hmm.
It would be really helpful if, or this is one way you could support me. I wasn't in a place where I could let people in that way and tell
Hmm.
them how they could be helpful. So if I didn't get the response that I was hoping for, and I don't even know what I was hoping for, that was it. Shut right back down. And
Yeah. I appreciate the ownership in that statement because when we're afraid to share something, we'll often have that like, let me take the smallest step in, but there's a part of us that's still believing that nobody can accept me for this. And I'll hear this from clients often who are struggling to express their needs. They're like, I'll like sort of say it, and then the person doesn't really get it. And then
mhm,
I interpret that as you can't understand me. I should never really have even asked for this.
so
So
true. So
so you're
true.
describing, I'm starting to reach out to friends. And as I'm hearing you talk about your friends, I can hear how discouraging that would be. Like the no, don't go there. And you're like, no, just understand me. And maybe in her, and I can also hear her being like, I've seen people struggling and I care so much about you and I just don't want you to have it.
Yes,
Or
yes.
the person
It's
who's like, you just shared something with me. Should I follow up with you? Should I wait for you, let you lead?
right, right. And I finally did share with another close friend who actually had struggled herself when she was younger. And
Mhm.
she's a physician and one of my very best friends to this day. And she was the first person that really supported me and
Wow.
outside my professional team. Sometimes it was very tough love, but I needed that. But she was always there to support me. But she understood eating disorders. We just had never talked about it before.
Hmm.
And that's what you get a lot of when you finally go public. You get a lot of the me too. And that has happened since I have gone public. And people like, oh my God, I struggled too. And you just sort of give other people permission to be vulnerable that they might not otherwise have felt comfortable sharing.
Hmm. What did it do for you when your friend acknowledged that she had had an eating disorder?
I felt like I finally had someone I could open up with. It took a while. I mean, I probably still had a wall in front of me, a lot of denial, a lot of I'm fine. But like I said, she
Hmm.
gave me the tough love when I needed it sometime, and it just brought us closer. And she told me about her own experiences. Here we had been friends forever, but we had never had these really deep conversations about mental health in general. And she had been amazing support for other issues that didn't involve mental health. But
Hmm.
it's sort of one of the reasons now I'm so passionate about providing peer support because
Hmm.
everybody needs someone outside their professional team that gets it, that you can share sort of the challenges, the small victories, everything along the way. And even though I had the most amazing dietitian and therapist, I often felt very isolated between those
Yeah.
appointments, sharing things that for me may have been a really big deal at the time, but
Hmm.
average person in my life wouldn't understand how significant uh, it was, let's say, to eat a sandwich for lunch. Most people who don't understand eating disorders would be like, yeah, I do that every day. What's the big deal? So we all need someone who can understand those victories, but also support us with the challenges. And this was the first friend that I felt really could give me that kind of support.
Yeah. What did the tough love look like?
The tough love was things like, you really look too thin. You really need to talk to your therapist about this more. You need to be honest with your dietitian about this. Just really helping to keep me on track. And, but she did it in such a supportive, loving way. I love you. I'm worried about you.
Mhm.
Um, you need to eat more. Just, in a really loving, caring, supportive way. But she would be so honest with me that sometimes it hurt, but I didn't take
Yeah.
it as hurt. I took it as love for a friend and that she was genuinely worried about me.
Yeah. Were you as accepting or as appreciative now, at the as you are now at the time when she was sharing those things with
Of
you?
course, I'm much more understanding and appreciative now. I will say that I was much further along in my recovery journey by the time we were having these
Okay.
conversations. And I don't think I would have been as open earlier on because I had so much myself to learn. So this was
Yeah.
later on in my recovery journey, but I still needed that support very much.
Yeah. Can you rewind to those moments when you first started to notice I'm struggling? Maybe there's something wrong. This can't be happening, but it is happening. I'm in midlife. Walk me through some of that.
Okay. Because there's been a lot of chapters in my life, I could give you a very long answer to that, but I'm not going to. Honestly, I
Okay.
had no idea anything was wrong. I will tell you that I was an athlete from a young age. I played
Mhm.
D1 college tennis, nationally ranked junior player. There was always a strong connection between food and exercise. And I would say my eating was disordered for a very long time. But for me, I think it was just a way of life. I didn't know anything different. And there's obviously some more details related to all that. But what happened in my 40s that actually led to the diagnosis is I hadn't played tennis in about 20 years or so. I went to law
Mhm.
school, got married, had 3 kids. My competitive career ended after college. But in my 40s, I got back into tennis, and that led to my
Mhm.
coaching career. I coached tennis for 13 years. I retired when my book came out, so I
Mhm.
could travel and all that. But the reality was when I got back into tennis, it once again became such a source of self-esteem. It was
Mhm.
such a great physical outlet for anxiety that wasn't diagnosed until my 40s. And
Mhm.
the reality was I became very fit and muscular and lost weight I didn't need to lose and couldn't afford to lose. And I am a very small person. I'm only 5'2" and very small
Mhm.
frame. So it was a physician of mine that actually noticed the weight loss and was very concerned. And I was referred to a dietitian and diagnosed with anorexia at my very first
Mhm.
appointment. But what was
Wow.
happening was around the same time that I got back into tennis and became very fit and muscular and lost this weight, I was diagnosed with moderate to severe asthma. So it was really the perfect storm at
Wow.
this time when I'm just getting back into tennis and getting a lot of positive attention. I would have these very serious flare-ups that kept me on the couch. My anxiety has always been around health issues, and the eating disorder became a way of coping with that. I developed this intense fear of gaining weight, and
Mhm.
the eating disorder helped reduce that fear.
Oh,
Really took over, but I think that the eating disorder was lurking for a long time, and I think the perfect
mhm.
storm of getting back into tennis and the diagnosis of asthma all around the same time. And when asthma would keep me off the court, I coped with that fear of weight gain by restricting my food intake, and one thing led to another. But there are so many other things that contributed to developing my eating disorder in midlife. And I'll just share a metaphor that sort of sums it up that my therapist used, and it's so on point. My eating disorder was as if it were a pot of water sort of simmering on the back burner for lots of years. And then when this perfect storm happened in my 40s, that simmering pot of water was on the front burner and came to a rapid boil. So it was sort of always there, but it was the combination of those two factors in a very profound way. The eating disorder
Mhm.
just really took hold.
Yeah. So it was always there in the sense said that your exercise was always linked to food. Was that like if I eat this much, I have to exercise this much to
Definitely. And I didn't realize anything was wrong. It's interesting. And going back in preparation for writing my memoir, I went back and read all these childhood diaries and journals that I had kept. I learned that my anxiety goes back to when I was a young child after my parents' divorce. It wasn't diagnosed till I was in my 40s. But what I also learned was that strong connection between food and exercise. There were so many statements throughout my diaries like, this makes me look fat, or I need to go on a diet. I ate too much at the restaurant. And then even later, like in my early 20s in law school, there was an entry in a diary about, oh, Jeff, my boyfriend at the time, my now husband, he wants to get pizza for dinner tonight, but I didn't exercise. I better go to the gym first. So there were so many instances of things like that, but I was never diagnosed with an eating disorder clinically until I was in my 40s.
Mhm. Something that I often hear from people within your age range, and tell me if this feels true to you, is that there's it was it seems that in the past it was almost unquestioned in society that everybody should be thin. And I'll have people tell me about like old advertisements that like I can't even imagine would fly today as and there's still a lot of fear of getting fat and judgment and shame around that. Uh, but it feels like it was largely unquestioned in the past, where now there's a pushback.
I definitely think we're making progress. I mean, obviously, I grew up before there was social media and all that, but there was certainly television and magazines and talk, and it was this sort of mindset, this diet culture mindset. And I grew up with a mother who her eating disorder was never diagnosed, but looking back, I remember she used to brag about how little she weighed on her wedding day, and she'd talk about, certain like fat was a bad, we shouldn't eat that. There are a lot of messages that I probably
Yeah.
internalized. I think that whole culture mentality got a lot worse with social media. And I always tell people I work with, you need to not follow anyone who is potentially triggering. You have it in your power to unlike, unfollow, whatever, if it's not helpful. So again, there wasn't the influence of social media, but there was certainly this mindset that somehow it's better to be thin. And I think just being an athlete, I know at one time my tennis team in college, it was a joke, but think about the ramifications. Our little slogan was when to eat. It was as if we had to earn our
Mhm.
food instead of focusing on how important it is to fuel our bodies appropriately so that we can compete well. So it always has been everywhere. But I think now with health at every size, there's so much, we've come a long way in focusing on, you can't tell by looking at someone whether they're healthy or not. And that bodies come in all shapes and sizes, and that's okay and normal. I think it probably was harder when I was growing up, but easier in that we didn't have the influence of social media.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. You had less of or less awareness around it, and you also were bombarded with less messages, in some ways, less messages about losing weight, though it sounds like it was very present even without social media.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Your doctor noticed that you were losing weight and referred you to a dietitian who then
Yes,
diagnosed you.
yes.
What was your reaction when you first heard that diagnosis?
Well, first of all, I probably held on to the phone number for several months before I made the call to the dietitian.
Hmm.
And I like to say when I first went, I probably went as if there were a brick wall in front of me. And it really took the professional expertise of both my dietitian and therapist to break down that wall brick by brick by brick. But I was in complete denial when I first got that diagnosis. Like I said earlier, how could I have anorexia? I'm in my 40s. I eat, do all these things. I'm not young. I'm not emaciated like I eat. How could I have anorexia? So I had so much to learn early on, and I'll always be grateful for my team for, first of all, reminding me that my eating disorder wasn't my fault. I think
Hmm.
I blamed myself at first. How could I let this happen? So they
Hmm.
were the first that really said, you know what? This is not your fault. It developed for a reason. It serves a purpose. It's a, complex illness with a variety of
Hmm.
factors, causes, manifestations, all that. So I remember learning, your eating disorder isn't about food. I'm like, what? How can my eating disorder not be about food? And it turned out my eating disorder really was the culmination of so many challenges throughout my life that I
Hmm.
went through, but it also became my catalyst for healing. So for that, I will always be grateful. But I definitely was in complete denial. It took a long time before I allowed in any vulnerability, before I let my guard down at all. My
Hmm.
dietitian's office and my therapist's office were the first safe space I had to start talking about the experiences in my life and how they impacted me. I grew up in a home where we didn't express negative thoughts or feelings. I didn't know vulnerability was okay. I thought being positive meant always being strong. I lost
Hmm.
both my parents to cancer when I was a young adult. I didn't know it was okay to grieve. I thought I should just be grateful for the good times. So I mean, I'm just scratching the surface, but let's just say there were a lot of contributing factors. So much of my treatment at the beginning was understanding that all these experiences all contributed to developing the eating disorder. It numbed so many difficult emotions for so many years. And so I had to learn that these behaviors with food, the restriction and overexercise and all that, those were ways of coping. And there were so many factors leading up. And then it was that asthma diagnosis and return to tennis that really just led me down that clinical eating disorder path. But I would say I was in complete denial at those early appointments, but not just that, even harder than that. It was really hard to get me to let my guard down and allow in vulnerability. That was a really early on. I learned that vulnerability would be necessary, something that I had always equated with weakness, something that
Yeah.
wasn't even, I didn't know that would be okay. So it probably took a while.
It feels like such a challenge to an entire value system as you're describing it,
Yes.
where you're taught in childhood, I need to be thin and muscular and look perfect and be happy at all times.
And be perfect, perfect
Uh,
student, perfect child, perfect tennis player. Like,
mm. And then you enter therapy and see this dietitian, and they're like, no, actually, you don't need to be thin, you need to be eating more. And instead of looking perfect, you should start to allow some of the pain you're experiencing to move to the surface and to be seen.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it was definitely a process.
Mhm.
Like I said, it was all outpatient. I would say it was a good 6 or 7 years of unraveling those layers and layers of emotions that I just stuffed inside. And also obviously learning, restoring my weight, learning how to fuel my body properly, especially for
Mhm.
tennis. But even when I'm laying on a couch doing absolutely nothing, learning that my body still needs nourishment for my organs to function properly. So between both of them, I just learned so many life lessons that help propel my recovery forward. But it's never linear. I definitely had a lot of bad days and setbacks like everybody else trying to recover from an eating disorder. But I did have an experience later on that really helped propel my recovery forward. And I learned a
Mhm.
lot of really important lessons from that difficult experience the
Yeah.
year before I wrote my recovery story.
It's so interesting for me to notice my own experiences as you're talking because I sort of wonder if this mirrors because I find myself as you're talking having the inclination to like find where the pain points are and explore them more because
Oh, interesting.
I feel so much of your positivity and that like framing even what was difficult in the ways that it helped you grow, which is a strength. And also I find myself being like, I want to hear some of the softer things or some of what feels more raw or maybe still does now.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for all that. Yeah, I mean, I look at it now, like I said, when we first started, I never ever could have envisioned where I am now. But I just sort of look at all those experiences that I've been through, the good, the bad, and everything. They're all a part of me.
Yeah.
And the message of my memoir, and actually the very last line is it's never too late to be a work in progress. It's
Hmm.
never too late is obvious because I want women and men too. I tend to work more with women to know that no matter where they are in their life's journey, no matter how old they are, no matter how long they've been
Hmm.
struggling, that recovery actually is possible. If I can do it, anybody can do it. But the work in progress piece, I think, is also an important point. We were talking about the word perfect. Recovery doesn't have to be perfect to be wonderful. There's really no such thing as perfect. We're always a work in progress. We can always become healthier in mind, body, and spirit. And so I just am very grateful for the lessons I've learned in my own recovery that now, I can apply to my daily life, but also give that message to those who are struggling that no matter what they've been through, and we've all been through something, nobody gets through this life without difficult challenges, that we can heal and become healthier. It doesn't mean those experiences evaporate and disappear. They become part of us. There is a way to um, give them less power over us, I guess. And I see that as people get older, so many people, they've been through such traumatic experiences and multiple chapters and get to a point where they don't know anything different. They just assume this is how it has to be. But it doesn't have to be that way. And I too have been through very difficult experiences, but I didn't even understand till my anorexia diagnosis how they had
Hmm.
impacted me and
Yeah.
what I needed to do to move forward and sort of just take that power and control away from the experiences, accept that they're a part of me, but I don't
Hmm.
have to give them the power that they always had over me, if that makes sense.
Yeah. There was a simultaneous movement toward more permission to feel and
Yes.
also giving less power or solidity to the way that those feelings were being expressed.
I definitely had to get permission to feel. I didn't know it was okay to talk about difficult emotions or feel any. I would literally feel guilty for having a negative thought or feeling. I thought I always had to
Mhm.
be positive and grateful and appreciate all the good.
Yeah. Can you describe some of those moments to you? Some of those moments when that brick wall, as you described it, started to crumble a little bit and there was space for sadness or more painful feelings?
Well, that's a great question. It goes along with one of the most important lessons I learned in recovery. So, my mom died of breast cancer when she was 60 and I was 33. My dad died of colon cancer when he was 56 and I was only 23. Now, I had very complicated relationships with both parents. Obviously, we don't need to go into that. My parents were divorced when I was young, But before each of them died, I actually had 2 good years with each of them, and they died 10 years apart. But this is one of the things that both in my dietitian's office and my therapist's office, for the very first time in my life, I had the opportunity to talk about those experiences with each of them 10 years apart, very different facts, and how they impacted me. But what came out of this, which is one of the most important life lessons I learned, that it would have prevented a lot of anguish had I learned this, as a teenager. I learned that you can actually feel conflicting emotions at the same time. And as someone with an anxious brain, I was so either or. So after each of my parents died, I just focused on being grateful that I had 2 good years with that parent. And I did the same thing 10 years later with the other. I had 2 good years with each of them right before they died, both difficult cancer deaths. If someone had told me back then, that I didn't learn till my dietitian and my therapist, that you could be sad and grieve and be angry and feel all sorts of messy emotions, and at the same time be grateful that I did have 2 good years with each of them before they died. So imagine stuffing all the messy, difficult emotions inside and just keeping the gratitude at the surface. I did not know until my recovery journey that it is okay to feel conflicting emotions at the same time. It sounds
Mm-hmm.
so simple, but that was life-changing for me. So
Yeah.
by allowing in that vulnerability for the very first time in my life to start talking about how I felt and what I went through, what they went through for the very first time in my late 40s, and understanding that it's okay to be sad. They died. They died, missed out on so much. But I just thought I was supposed to focus on the positive. So that's really the most profound example of what I was able to do by allowing in vulnerability. But it
Yeah.
also emphasizes one of the most important lessons I learned, that sounds so simple, but that we need to feel all emotions, both the positive and negative ones, and even conflicting ones at the very same time. Never knew that. Never had permission to feel the negative ones.
Yeah. And even now, when you describe the pain, it always has to be tied to a lesson of some kind.
Mhm. It's
Like the
true. And I
pain.
feel like recovery has given me those life lessons that I needed, and better late than never. But like I said, it would have avoided a lot of anguish had I known these things sooner. But I'm grateful now that I've learned these lessons, and many others too, that help me live my life in a much healthier space now.
Yeah. And I can hear the pattern that you were taught and describing playing out here as you bounce between, like, there was a little bit of pain there. It feels almost like it's hard for me to get to know that pain because we move so quickly into what you've learned from it.
Well, I write in excruciating detail about that pain in my memoir. And
Hmm.
that's why I said when I initially started writing, it was to help myself heal on the deepest level possible. That was the one and only purpose of writing.
Hmm.
So it certainly did what I hoped it would, to heal on a deeper level. So yes, now the more positive things come out.
Yeah.
But I actually kept journals during the time of both their illnesses and deaths, and I share quotes throughout my memoir from those times. And it was very, very painful, but writing about it, putting it into words,
Yeah.
has definitely helped me heal. But again, like I said earlier, those difficult experiences, they're a part of me. I am who I am, and all our
Hmm.
experiences, good and bad, make
Yeah.
us who we are. So
Hmm. Yeah. I noticed as you were talking a moment of sadness as you were starting to share about your memoir and some of what you were processing at the time.
very, very, a lot of sadness, a lot of hurt, a lot of pain. Both my parents hurt me very deeply at different times in my life. There was a lot of emotional pain and trauma. That's another lesson I learned. I didn't know trauma could be emotional.
Hmm.
So again, there's been so many blessings in my life and lots of privilege. So even though I had been through painful times and emotional trauma, once again, I didn't know that trauma could be emotional, and I thought I was just supposed to appreciate the blessings and privilege and the good life that I am grateful to be able to live. But again, it's this my recovery gave me the opportunity to look at everything in a completely different way.
Yeah.
I guess the pain was there, but I just numbed it. And my eating disorder was the way I did that.
Yeah. And I know that for like all of us have areas in our life like you're describing where we heal the pain and then it's gone or it's translated into something bigger and better. And the areas that the pain just lingers and we learn to stay with it and let it be there.
Hmm. No, it's very true. And actually, after my mom died, I got involved with hospice, became a hospice volunteer, and long story short, ended up starting a bereavement group in my town, and it's still going strong after 13 years. I now have people who lead it with me because I travel and can't always be there. But I learned to help others with their grief before I was really in touch with my own. But a
Wow.
hospice chaplain a long time ago said to me, don't wait until you're healed before you help others. It will help you heal
Mm-hmm.
to help others.
Mm-hmm.
But again, because I was
Yeah.
so anxiety, black and white, either or, I was helping other
Mm-hmm.
people, knowing how to help people, but didn't know how to help myself at first. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, a lot comes out of our experiences.
Yeah.
And again, it's giving others what I wish I had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you describe to me some of the emotional qualities, both as you were experiencing them internally and how they were expressed in those moments when you're in therapy and suddenly having permission to feel for the first time, it sounds like?
Yes, that's a good question. I'll use an example with my therapist that I talk about a lot. I mean, she's so skilled. I still see her. I haven't seen a dietitian in many, many years, but hopefully I'll always have my therapist.
Yeah.
And she's so good at what she does. She'd know what questions to ask. And often I would
Mhm.
start to tear up. But I honestly was, and this is the 100% truth, I was scared that if I ever started to really cry, that I wouldn't be able to stop. So I did
Wow.
everything I could to hold back the tears. But then often after my appointment, I'd get in my car and I would just start sobbing. That was
Wow.
feel the feelings. That was doing the hard work of recovery. And it was exhausting and so difficult, but it really helped me move forward in recovery by feeling the feeling. So even though I wasn't able to always do it in my therapist's office, she knew
Hmm.
what I needed to talk about to get those feelings out. I learned pretty
Yeah.
quickly not to schedule anything important immediately after my appointment because I can remember so many times getting into my car and just sobbing. And, I'm sure for a long time with her at first, I did everything I could to avoid even the
Hmm.
tears. And then,
Wow.
eventually I would tear up as I felt more comfortable, but I never sobbed in her office. It was always after. But that's the hard work of recovery, feeling the feelings. And you can't always do it in the 45 minutes you have with your therapist. And the same
Hmm.
thing, a dietitian, talking about with her, she was amazing, meal plans, food, accountability, talking about it, talking about what contributed to my eating disorder and all that. But the reality is she couldn't eat the food for me. I still had to eat the food and I had to eat it every day, all day in between those appointments. So again, that's the hard work of recovery is
Yeah.
being able to do those hard things even
Hmm.
when you're not in the safe space. So I'm so grateful that I had that safe space. Absolutely essential. Nobody can recover without it. But so much of the hard work of recovery also takes place outside those appointments. So
Hmm.
that's where
Yeah.
I felt a lot of the feelings.
I felt myself getting chills as you're describing that fear of if I start crying, I'll just never stop. And the way that you were able to just like start sobbing in the car. What was your experience of that fear? If I start, I'll never stop. What actually happened?
I think just because I had held it together for so long and stuffed so many difficult emotions inside for so many years, it doesn't mean I never cried. I certainly definitely cried, especially after both my parents' deaths, but not enough. And I didn't have anyone to talk about how I was feeling. And it would just take so much out of me. I would do everything to avoid it. So
Mhm.
I think then when I finally, after all these chapters, had this safe space, I was scared that if I went back and started talking about all these things, that's where I thought if I ever started to cry, I wouldn't be able to stop because we're talking about decades of internalized emotions. And then all of a sudden, you allow invulnerability and you can start talking about it. That was like, oh my God, if I start talking about all these things sitting here, I'm just going to
Mhm.
completely lose it and I won't be able to stop crying, not recognizing that it doesn't all happen at once. Over
Mhm.
time, we need to feel those feelings.
Mhm. So you had that fear and you were still able to feel. And to what extent did those feelings initially and then over time disrupt your ability to live in the way you expected them to, um, and or feel overwhelming in the way you had expected
It
them
definitely
to?
felt overwhelming at times, but I think it was really a process. So when I
Yeah.
look back, over being overwhelmed doesn't come to mind. It was more this ongoing process. At times, it certainly felt overwhelming, like if I had a particularly
Yeah.
difficult session and then was sobbing for a bit. It always felt better afterwards. It was all part of sort of just going back, like I said, and unraveling those layers and layers of suppressed emotions. But I think because it was just this logical progression through my recovery journey with, like I said, steps sideways, backwards, all over the place. Um, it was probably more gradual than it
Mm-hmm.
would have been. So yes, at times it was definitely overwhelming, but when I look back on it, it was this journey, it was this process, and over time, it had the impact that it needed to. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah, so there were times when the intensity of the emotions was a lot to handle, and
definitely, but I kept it all to myself. It's not like I ever said to anybody, "Oh, I had such a difficult time today after my session with my therapist. I just burst into
yeah.
tears." I kept it 100% private. I didn't talk about that at all until I started sharing my story publicly.
Wow. What was the fear?
Sorry.
What was the fear before you started sharing with people your more difficult moments?
I think that just scared of vulnerability. I had always been the strong one. I had always been the one that friends came to, even from a young age when they were struggling, and I'd be like, it's okay. I'd be the one letting them know it's okay. Whereas I didn't give myself that same grace that it was okay to not be okay. It was okay for other people, and I'm the one that they felt comfortable coming
Mhm.
to, but it wasn't okay for me.
Yeah, you were afraid of breaking some of your own internalized expectations in some way.
I think it's just everything that was ingrained in me from such a young age. And I think what really started it was, and again, I won't go into all the details. My parents were divorced when I was 7 years old. And this was at a time when divorce wasn't as common as it was. But I think what happened was we were a suburban family of four. I have one sister who's 6 years younger than me. And when my dad left, my mom went on as if nothing happened. She modeled for me from a very young age that when these traumatic changes happen in our lives, we power through, we go on as
Hmm.
if nothing happened. So we went on as a suburban family of three. I was seven, my sister was not even one yet. And
Wow.
there was no one who ever said, how are you feeling? How are you doing? This must be so hard. I remember at first my mom just said my dad was on a business trip, but obviously couldn't say that
Wow.
too long. And he did travel for work. So it's certainly plausible at the beginning, but turned out he was having an affair with another well-respected person in the community. My dad was a very well-respected lawyer, and people like him in the 70s didn't just walk out on their wives and young children. But there just wasn't the focus on the emotional needs of everyone involved. And divorce is never good for anybody involved. But I hope that now there is more of a focus on the
Mhm.
emotional impact for everyone, no matter what the circumstances. But there was zero focus on any emotions. And
Wow.
I learned from a young age that we just go on as if nothing happened. And
Hmm.
that's what I learned to do. And that's why I never learned to talk about negative feelings or emotions because it was never modeled for me that it was okay to. And my mom, she
Oh,
herself had mental health issues that were never diagnosed. And it's sad. I mean, because she just lived her life thinking that she was perfect and that it was everyone else who had issues. And then she
Yeah.
became very rigid and controlling and unpredictable as a result of her never having dealt with this traumatic change in our lives in a healthy way.
Wow. S- Some of the, or oftentimes when we're also, we pick up on like if I break those expectations people have of me or I'm not perfect, will I be rejected?
Mhm.
And I'm noticing as you're sharing some of your story with me that I feel closer to you, which I imagine is some of what you experience as you share your story more widely as well.
Thank you. Yes, I'm so grateful that I am able to be so open and honest because one of the things that comes out of recovery is connections and the ability to connect with others in an authentic way. And I
Mhm.
learned with my mom pretty early on, I often felt with her like I was walking on eggshells because I didn't know which version I was going to get. Sometimes she could be very loving and funny and wonderful. And then other times I felt like she was a witch that she would yell at me for no reason. And those were her own issues.
Mhm.
But of course, I internalized that and I learned pretty quickly that the way to make her happy was to be this perfect good girl and do really well in school and do well in tennis, and then all would be good. So I felt like a failure, like I was disappointing her if I lost a tennis match or got a grade that wasn't up to her standards. But those things, by doing really well, it made her happy. So I felt less like I was walking on eggshells. So you live
Mhm.
like that for lots of years. It's not surprising that something, obviously the anxiety is how my brain was wired. But again, this
Mhm.
anxiety, and I see unequivocal evidence of it in these diaries, goes back to a very young age, always surrounding health and safety. It all started after my
Mhm.
parents' divorce, but was not diagnosed for years. And it never could have been because my mother was just like, she probably wouldn't have believed in help for any mental health
Mhm.
issues. Um,
Wow.
we just have to be perfect and strong and have this
Mhm.
facade that everything's great. Um,
Mhm.
and I look back, I wish she could have gotten help. I think she would have had a much happier adult life had she gotten
Yeah.
help that she deserved.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, as you're describing that, like your mom showing up in different ways, like sometimes very loving and sometimes very critical, and the way that you learn to adapt to that, I'm thinking about you as a child and as children, and I'm also thinking about myself as a parent
Mm.
because like I have young kids and I'm a therapist, so I hope I encourage them to feel whatever they feel. And also I'm like, I've noticed with my daughter, she's 4 years old now, and even she'd do this even when she was 2 years old. Like I would be upset with her about something or starting to lose my patience, and she'd suddenly put on like the sweetest face ever or
Oh,
be like, Mommy, I love you. And I'm like, it was like it was so sweet. And also I felt that like you're describing that like I want you to know that you can be whatever you're feeling with me. So I can,
right. And they
yeah.
need to see that we as parents are human. I mean, obviously, when they're young, like your kids, what's most important, obviously, is that they feel loved and safe and secure and all those things that set the stage. But as they get older, I think it's really important that they learn that it's okay to be human and that there's no such thing
Mhm.
as a perfect mom and dad or whatever. We're human beings too, and we feel feelings, all
Yeah.
kinds of feelings. Again,
Mhm.
I didn't learn until I was in my late 40s that it's okay to be human.
Yeah.
Imagine that. And so
Yeah.
our kids need to see that we're not perfect. Nobody is.
Hmm.
It's okay to be human. It's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to make mistakes, and you're still loved. What they need is that unconditional love. And I often felt I had to earn it. Even though there's
Hmm.
no question that my parents love me, I often felt I had to earn it. But what kids need from a very young age is that unconditional love, that knowing that
Yeah.
nothing can hurt that, no matter what
Hmm.
is going on.
Yeah. That I'll always love you. And also, if I lose patience, it's not because there's something wrong with you, but it's because
Yes.
I'm a human being. And I also, just like you, have those. Like,
Yep. We all have ups and downs, and I'm sure you could have a really bad day and you try not to be impatient, but you're human, and also little kids, it takes a lot of energy.
yeah, there was a moment a while earlier in our conversation where you were talking about your complicated relationship with your parents, and you were like, we don't need to go into all of that. And was that like, I don't want to talk badly about my parents, and then you started to share some of what was going on at the time. What was happening for you in that moment? Like, we don't need to go into all of that. What was the feeling behind that?
It was honestly more because there's a lot of details to
Hmm.
both my relationships with my mother and my father.
Yeah.
Very complicated, like I said, very hurtful at times, but lots of blessings and privilege as well. Obviously, I'm not
Hmm.
giving you all the details and facts, but I ended up having 2 good years with each of them right before they died.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, that's why I didn't grieve in a healthy way.
Yeah.
So the relationships were complicated. I am at a place in my life now where, after years and years of carrying around a lot of sadness just beneath the
Mhm.
surface as a result of things I went through with both of them, and even though I, you know, happy living my life, there was always this layer of sadness just beneath the surface.
Mhm.
The way I look back on it now is, yes, they hurt me. Yes, there were some really difficult times, but I'm also able to say, you know what? They probably did the best they could at that time. I wish it had been different, but they did the best they could at that time. And
Mhm.
now I feel like all the experiences, good and bad, um, sad and happy, everything you could say, they're all a part of me. But I wouldn't say
Mhm.
it's forgiveness. I think it's more just, and they've been gone a long time. Honestly, I don't think I could have written my book if either one of them were still alive, because I was
Mhm.
completely honest and open. But I'm
Wow.
able now to give those experiences less power over me. And
Mhm.
after writing my memoir, I can honestly say that layer of sadness just beneath the surface is not there anymore. And I think that comes from that, it's just like a sigh of relief, the freedom, the authenticity, the vulnerability, all those gifts of recovery. That's what I actually call my mentorship in groups businesses, gifts of recovery, because I feel like everything I'm able to do now is a gift of my own recovery, including being able to acknowledge that things happened the way they did. They did the best they could at the time. It's really unfortunate, some of the things, but I can't change what happened in the past. I can change how
Mhm.
I respond to what happened in the past and
Yeah.
recognize that it'll always be a part of me, but I don't have to let it drag me down anymore.
Yeah. And the way that you've come to that, like, expanded space that can hold it all was, or the positivity that you express now, like that I've come to some place where I can acknowledge what was difficult and also what went well. Now it's not a like, let me just shut down all the pain and like everything is great, let me be happy.
Yes,
It's a
it's
lot
all
deeper
still
after
there.
having, but yeah.
It's all still there, but just learning from it more, learning how I have 3 adult children and learning from my own experiences to hopefully be a better parent,
Mhm.
learning how I want to live my life today. Really important lessons come out of very difficult experiences that we can't necessarily see at the time.
Mhm.
But we can't
Yeah.
ignore those experiences, or they can lead to really difficult ways of coping, such as eating disorders or substance use or alcoholism. They're all
Yeah.
maladaptive ways of coping with the things we go through. And if we can,
Mhm.
hit them head on and not try and tiptoe around them, we'll get to the other side. But those experiences remain a part of us.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you so much, Betsy. Where can people find you if they're interested and want to learn more about your work?
Well, thank you for asking. My book, The Longest Match, Rallying to Defeat an Eating Disorder in Midlife, is available on Amazon and other sites. And my website is betsybrenner.com, which says a lot about my book and the work that I do now. And I'm on Instagram at Betsy Brenner author. That's where I tend to post a lot of groups that I'm hosting and things like that, and my traveling and speaking. And I love speaking to people who are currently in treatment, but also support groups, clinicians, women's groups, anybody who wants to hear my message, because it's really about, it's not only for me, the eating disorder was the culmination of my life and the catalyst for healing. People can fill in whatever facts and stories and chapters they want, but my message is more about how can we be healthier in mind, body, and spirit, even though we've been through difficult chapters in our lives. So I also do a lot now with student athlete mental health, because I check those boxes too as a D1 college athlete and longtime coach. So I also really believe strongly in working with athletes and letting them know that they are human beings first. So I just
Yeah.
love sharing my story. And I always say, if one person can take one thing from my story that helps them take even a baby step forward in their own journey, what more could I ask?